You know how there are some podcasts where from the moment you start listening, you're just completely hooked? Why aren't all podcasts like that? Well, I have a theory that it's because most people think that once they get a listener to start listening, that the listener is going to keep listening, which is simply not true. So in this video, we're going to break down a simple but powerful formula that you can use for your first podcast episode, and it's going to keep your listeners engaged from the beginning until the end. Let's get into it. Hey, I'm Hiwote. I'm a podcast producer and the creator of the Emerging Voices Podcasting Accelerator. And I've made shows like Esther Perel's Where Should We Begin?, This Is Dating, Priya Parker's Together Apart for the New York Times, and many other shows for brands like TED, Gates Foundation, etc. And the formula I'm about to share with you is the exact one that we have used on all of these shows. So every great podcast episode takes the listener on a journey, meaning you have to meet your listener where they're at, and then you have to take them to a different state, an emotional state, than they were in when they first met you. Now, this formula is going to help you do exactly that, take them on a journey. But how fun, funny, heartwarming, or emotional your story is depends on what you add to this structure. So step one in the formula is your anchor, otherwise known as your hook. This is something that we use to open your episode with. And actually, we're going to talk about your hook at the very end. We're going to jump into step two of your formula. Step two is your show ID. This should take between 30 seconds and 1 minute. This is where you tell us what we're listening to, who you are, and explain to the listener a little bit about what they're getting into. So a formula for this is you're listening to blank, the podcast name, and then a short description. I'm your name. Let's use This Is Dating as an example. This is a show I made when I was working at a company called Magnificent Noise. And as producers, we would introduce the show and ourselves. So this is a line that I've used. This is Dating, a series of recorded first dates. And then my co-producer introduces herself. And I say, I'm Hiwote. We're producers on this show. So it's that simple. Step three of the formula is the story. So this is about 1 to 3-ish minutes long. There are no hard and fast rules, but I'm giving you a time frame because I find my students often ask me, like, how long should each of these sections be? I think it's helpful when you're starting out to have a sense of how long they should be. But as you get better and better, you can experiment and see what feels right to you and your audience. So the context is really where you are explaining to your listener why they should care. And you're not explaining it through your words, you're demonstrating it by telling some sort of story. Often what this looks like is we meet a character and the challenge that they're going through or that they're going to go through. So let's say you're a solo podcaster and you've been struggling to form a habit, okay? So you've come to this place where you're deciding that maybe I need to check whether I'm dopamine depleted. And so in this episode, you're gonna tell us, hey, I've really been struggling to form the habit of working out. I've tried for so long and I find that I just can't get it to stick. And lately, I've been wondering if maybe this is a dopamine issue. So in today's episode, we're going to be speaking with Jane, ABC, about how dopamine plays a role in habit formation. Jane is an expert in blah, blah, blah. She has written a book on XYZ. Okay? This is you setting up the context for us in a clear and succinct way so that we can get to whether it's the interview or whatever it is that is going to be the actual story, the actual meat of the episode. So that is step three, setting up the context, which is, in other words, a story. Next up, we have challenges and resolutions. This is the meat of your episode. If I had to give you a time frame for this, I would say 20 to 30-ish minutes long. And there really are no hard and fast rules because you can tell this story, these challenges and these resolutions really effectively in 5 minutes or in 45 minutes. It depends on what actually comes out during your actual interview, if you're making an interview-based show or as you're exploring it in a solo-based show. So let's talk a little bit about what you should do if you have a solo episode. This section, if you have a solo episode, looks like you introducing the challenges that you had and then you explaining how you got to the resolution or the insight or the shift in perspective for yourself. And one really important piece of advice I have for you here is when you are preparing for the episode, if you're making a solo episode, I really think it's important for you to write down bullet points of what you're going to talk about instead of scripting everything that you're going to say. And the reason for this is that basically everybody, if they have a script in front of them, they're going to read the script. That just sounds way more rigid than if you look at a bullet point and then riff on it. Sure, it might take you a bit longer when you're starting, but it's also just going to sound way more natural, which makes it easy for your listener to connect with you as a human being. Another thing you can do is you can script it out, but then just pull out the highlights and put it into a document and refer to that as you're telling the story. Again, don't forget, your goal is to get your listener to understand the challenges that you had, which hopefully they also have, which is why they're listening, and the solutions that you got to. And one note, they don't necessarily need to have the same problems, but they should at least, for whatever reason, be interested in finding a resolution to those problems. That's something that's really important for solo podcasters to understand, because I know many who start a solo podcast and then feel frustrated that nobody is listening. That's it for solo podcast episodes. What about if you're making an interview-based show? If that's the case, this section where you are introducing the challenges and resolutions really just looks like you scripting really good questions that address a key theme that is going to be explored in this episode. So if earlier we talked about habit formation and dopamine, right? So in this episode, you know that you are going to be talking about habit formation and our biology. So your questions should very clearly be connected to that and the person who is going to be addressing those problems. So one important note here is if you're interviewing an expert, the challenges and the insights are going to come from a very different perspective than if you're interviewing someone who is not an expert. If you're interviewing an expert, you are positioning yourself and your listener as the people with the challenges who need this person to help them get some insights so that they can evolve, right? But if you're interviewing someone who is not an expert, but the two of you are talking about how you've struggled in your habits and how you've grown in your habit formation, then it's going to feel very different because you're not expecting them to give you insights that is necessarily going to be prescriptive. It's much more this person telling you about their own journey, their own experience, and their own insights. So when you're formulating questions for these two different kinds of people, you want to be mindful of that because you don't want to put someone who's not an expert in the position where they feel like they have to give advice from an expert's perspective. And it's also just harder to build trust with your audience if you are doing something like that because your audience is going to wonder, why should I trust Joe Schmo here to tell me how to build my habits when really you could be interviewing someone who can actually give Joe the exact advice that they need that's scientifically backed or whatever your listener believes in. So the key thing you want to remember here is know your key themes that you're going to be exploring in this episode and then form questions that get at those key themes and anything that helps build on top of that. Next up, we have the close. This is about 1 to 3 minutes long. This is where you reflect and direct. So you're reflecting on your experience having been a part of this interview or having been the person sharing what you just shared as a solo podcaster. And then you want to tell your listener what it is that you want them to do next. Here is a sample that I've written for you. This conversation triggered ABC for me. I'd love to hear how this sat with you. If you join the mailing list below, you can reply to any of my emails and tell me about your experience with this episode. And if you want to support the show, please write a review. It's super helpful in getting new people to discover this show. Now, obviously, this is just a sample, but you really want people to remember to rate, review, subscribe to your podcast. And you also want them to feel like you are also reflecting on what you all just heard in the same way that you hope that they do. Now let's talk about your hook. Finally, we wait for the end for this part because you want to make sure that your episode has taken shape and you can make a promise about the episode because it's already in existence. So this is the first 90-ish seconds of your episode, and this is where you tell them why they need to keep listening. And you do that in one of three really simple ways. The first is you tell them a super interesting short story that intrigues them and makes them want to keep listening. The second is you ask them a relatable question that they might have already thought about or should be thinking about. And the third is you introduce a very bold statement that has to get them thinking, wait, I have to know what happens next. As an example, for the short story, this is something that Esther Perel does really, really well. If you listen to any of the Where Should We Begin episodes, they all open with a really compelling short story from the couple that you're about to hear in the episode. And for those of you that don't know, Where Should We Begin is a couples therapy show. So you basically listen in on couples therapy sessions. As an example, for a short story, you might tell your audience, sticking with this dopamine example, you might tell them that you met the most impressive person the other day. They have been working out consistently for the last 10 years and you were fascinated because before the last 10 years, they were a total couch potato. And then you can end it with something like, so what was the magic trick? How did this person change? And how can I be like that too? So something like that where you tell them a story and then you end on like, wait, why aren't we also the same way? Example of a bold statement would look like, listen, if you don't have your dopamine in check, you basically can't ever form a good habit. So in this episode, we're going to explore exactly how to solve for that. And if you are trying to write a relatable question at the beginning, you might say something like, do you feel like you've just been trying for years to form a new habit, and no matter how hard you try, you can't ever seem to get it to stick? Well, in this episode, we're going to explore exactly how to form habits by hacking your biology. I hate the word hacking, but that's basically the gist of it. So that is the framework. You start with a hook, you give us your show ID, you give us your context, you take us through the challenges and resolutions, and then you give us a close where you reflect and direct. The reason this formula works is because it meets the listener where they're at, it guides them through a shift, and then it empowers them to take ownership of the insight so that they can take action in whatever way makes sense for them. Now it is your turn. I'd love to hear what your first podcast is going to be about, and I'd love for you to use this formula in actually scripting your first episode. This formula came out of lesson 3 from the Emerging Voices Podcasting Accelerator, which I run. So if you want an exact copy of this lesson in your inbox, just click the link in the video description below. I will see you in the next video.